Welcome back, everyone. My name is Dan Vega, Spring Developer Advocate for VMware, and today we are using ChatGPT to create a new Spring Boot application, more specifically a REST API. At this point, I'm sure you've heard of ChatGPT. I'm not going to go into a one-on-one of what it is, how to use it. If you're interested in that, we could do a video on that, but I think at this point you've been inundated by ChatGPT videos, so we'll kind of skip that. In my experience, ChatGPT is really good at three things when it comes to code. Number one, defining a starting point. We're going to ask ChatGPT to give me a list of steps that it would take to create a Spring Boot application or create a REST API in Spring Boot. So this is really good because it gives you a list of steps that you need to go through to actually perform the task that you're trying to do. Now, you still need some limited knowledge of what you're trying to accomplish because everything's not always correct, but you can get an idea of what you're doing. This is really good when you're moving over to something that's pretty new to you. This is a great way to dive into that particular topic. Number two, writing code for a specific task. Along the way of following these steps, I need to do something and maybe I need to produce some code. So I know that I need to create a model that represents, say, a product in my system. And this is going to be a Java record or a Java class, whatever you're using. And here are the properties that I'm going to use. Please produce that set of code for me. So if you have a very specific thing that you're trying to write code for, I'm writing a model, I'm writing a controller, I'm writing a repository, I need to do this. ChatGPT is really good at that. Finally, number three is explaining a block of code. Here's a block of code that I came across. I'm not really sure what it does. Can you explain that to me? And it will actually write out the explanation for what that code is doing. So again, this is a great learning tool, a great way to kind of get started with a project, but it's not always correct. So do not take it verbatim. You cannot just tell ChatGPT to write you an entire Spring Boot application that does all of these kind of intricate things and hope to get a final result out of that. There needs to be some human intervention. You need to have some knowledge. You need to understand Java. You need to understand Spring Boot at a surface level before you can go in and do this. But we're going to have some fun with this today. So we're going to dive in. We're going to ask ChatGPT to write us a Spring Boot REST API. All right, to get started, we're going to head over to chat.openai.com/chat. You are going to need to log in with an account and you may not be able to use it right away. It is, depending on the time that you're using it, it has really been hitting capacity lately. They announced a ChatGPT Plus plan that's coming, but right now it doesn't always work. So we're going to hope it does right here. So the first thing that I want to do is remember the first kind of key that I thought ChatGPT can really help us with is asking it to provide a series of steps. So what I want to ask it is, what are the list of steps needed to create a REST API in Spring Boot that talks to a database? And if we go ahead and hit enter, we will see it think for a second, and then it's going to come back with a list of high-level steps. So I really like that. This is a list of high-level steps. This is not going to be detailed. This is kind of to get you started. So number one, set up a Spring Boot project with the necessary dependencies, such as Spring Web, Spring Data JPA, and a database connector. That's mostly right. We may not want to use Spring Data JPA. We may want to use something like Spring Data JDBC or just a JDBC template, but I digress. That'll work. Define the entity class that will map the database tables. That's correct. If you're using, I guess if you're using JPA or even JDBC, you're kind of creating a class that maps to that. Configure the data source and entity manager in the application properties or YAML file. Yes, so depending on what database you're using, if you're using an H2 in-memory database, you don't really need to define anything, but that is correct. Create a repository interface that extends JPA repository to perform CRUD operations on the entity class. Great. Really good start so far. Then you need to implement the REST API controllers using Spring MVC to handle HTTP requests and return responses. Really good. Use the repository interface in the controllers to fetch or persist data to the database. I love that. I think a lot of the code out on the internet that you'll find has an intermediate service layer to do that as well. when all the service layer is doing is using a repository. I don't like doing that. If all I'm doing is talking to a database, I'm just going to use a repository. There's no reason to go to a service layer. So I like that, that suggestion there. And then finally, run the application and test the API using a tool such as Postman. Really great. You can write tests to test that, sure. We can ask ChatGPT to help us with that. But yeah, you can test it using a tool called Postman. You can use it from curl or the command line, or in IntelliJ, we have a really nice HTTP client that we can use inside of there as well. So I like the note at the end too. This is just a high-level overview, and the exact steps may vary depending on the specific requirements and complexity of the API. So this is really great. Again, when I'm jumping into a new project, this is a really great thing to do no matter what language, framework, project you're on. This is a really great starting point. So now we're going to take this starting point and use this as the basis for creating our application. So to do so, number one, set up a Spring Boot project with the necessary dependencies using Spring Web, Spring Data JPA, and the database connector. Let's go ahead and head over to start.spring.io and create a new project here. I'm going to create a new Maven project using Java, and the latest version of Spring Boot at the time of this recording is 3.0.2. We're going to add some metadata here, so dev.danvega. And what we'll create here is, I've been using a blog example lately, so I'm creating a REST API to get a list of articles for a blog that I'm writing. So that is our artifact. We're going to use jar packaging. We're going to use Java 17, and then we need our dependency. These are the different things that we're going to use within our application to build our application. It said at ChatGPT that we should use web, which is correct. I'm going to use Spring Web. I also need something like Spring Data JPA. I also need something like a database driver. So I'm going to use H2. So I think this is a really good start. The important thing to note that, again, if we got more specific requirements down the line of what we need to build, we can always add these dependencies later, but this is a good start. So let's go ahead and click this generate button. This is going to give us a zip. I'm going to go ahead and download that zip. I'm going to open that up in my favorite IDE, IntelliJ IDEA. You can open up in whatever text editor or IDE you're most productive. All right, so I've opened up this project in IntelliJ and I copied in the text prompt that we gave ChatGPT and the answer, so we can just follow along in here. And we don't need to keep referring back to it. Plus, again, it's been so flaky lately that I may be recording this over a longer period of time. So number one is done. We were able to set up a new Spring Boot project with the necessary dependencies. If you want to double check that, you can just go into your pom.xml. We see that we have a new Spring Boot 3.0.2 project. The dependencies that we have selected are Spring Data, Spring Boot Starter, Data JPA, the Spring Boot Starter Web, and our H2 database as a runtime dependency. So we have everything we need, at least to get started. Next, we need to define the entity class that maps to the database tables. So we're only going to have one table in this. We'll call it a post. And then we need to kind of figure out what the post is going to contain. So let's just come down here and we'll say that we have a post. Maybe a post has something like an ID, a title, maybe a slug. So like / hello world, right? So we have a slug and maybe a date created, a date updated. And so ID, title, obviously we need a body here. So should we call this body or content maybe? So ID, title, content, slug, date created, date updated. We don't really need an author. This one is just going to be for us. So I think this is a really good list. So I'm going to go back to ChatGPT. And we're going to say, let's see if we can. Now, this is something with ChatGPT is you got to be very specific. If you're general, you're going to get very general, generic answers. The more specific you get, the more information you provide to ChatGPT, the better responses you're going to get. So let's say that we need to create a Spring Boot entity for a post type that includes the following properties. So let's see. All right, so it's done and it looks pretty good. So here's an example of a Spring Boot entity class for a post type with the specified properties. So we have, we've marked it with @entity. So the only thing here is, again, ChatGPT is not caught up. This is to the end of 2021. So it doesn't know about Spring Boot 3 yet. And in Spring Boot 3, we've moved away from Java EE to Jakarta EE. So these package names will just be a little bit different. So that's just the first thing that you may want to note here. We've marked it with @entity. We've marked it with @table. I probably wouldn't mark it with @table. I don't need to change the table name. So it depends on what you want to do there. So we have a public class post. We have a long ID. So this is going to be @ID, @generated value. This is going to be generation type identity. Then we have some properties here: private string title, content, slug, all those look good. Then I have private date, date created, date updated. So I would probably change this. I don't want to use a date. I would want to use something like a local date time. We want to know when it was updated and at what time. So I'm going to change those as well. We'll also need our getters and setters, and I'll also need a toString. But this is a good start. So let's just copy this verbatim and let's head over to IntelliJ. And in IntelliJ here under source main Java, and here I'm going to create a new Java class. We'll call this, I'm going to push this under a model package. We'll call this post, and that will put us here. And let's go ahead and paste this in. So now as we jump up here, you could see in our Spring Boot 3 application, we are basically saying, hey, I'm pulling in the Jakarta persistence, Jakarta generated value. So that's good that it kind of figured that out. Again, I don't need to change this. And then we need to bring in ID, and it is not finding that. So let's see, there we go. And then our generated value is using a generation type identity. So we have a long ID, title, content, slug. I'm going to use, again, local date time. And we're going to use local date time here. So we do need some getters and setters. So I'm going to, oh yeah, so I guess it's funny that this came up. So I'm actually using GitHub Copilot. I normally turn this off for my videos because it's a little bit of a distraction. I always get comments like, hey, what is that thing doing that's suggesting all that code? That's GitHub Copilot. Funny enough, it uses OpenAI's codex behind the scene, which is what ChatGPT is using to kind of create some code. So ChatGPT didn't suggest to us that we have a Noir constructor, but if you've done any JPA in the past, you know that we need one. So GitHub Copilot here is saying, hey, you should probably include one. So that's one thing. Then we also need another constructor, right, to take kind of all args. So GitHub Copilot is helping us out there. So I guess maybe the title of this video should be, can OpenAI write a Spring Boot application? Because the two together are doing a really good job so far. So then I need some getters and setters. I'm going to generate those just using my IDE. And I also need a toString. I'm going to generate that as well. And this is looking pretty good. So I like what we have so far. Let's go back to the README. We have done number 1. We have done number 2. Number 3 is to configure the data source and entity manager in the application properties or YAML. So we don't need to really configure an entity manager here. We'll get one out of the box with Hibernate and all that good stuff. So let's just go ahead and configure our data source under source main resources, and we'll go to application.properties. When using the H2 database, I want to say, I don't want to generate a unique name. So I want to turn that off. I want to set a data source name for blog. And finally, I want to enable the H2 console because that will allow us to take a look at the database. So I'm really happy with this so far. Let's go ahead and move on to number 4. All right, so the next one is create a repository interface that extends JPA repository to perform CRUD operations on the entity classes. So let's take these keywords, CRUD operations. Let's go back to our Chat GPT, and it already remembers that it created this post. So let's say create a Spring Data repository that extends JPA repository for the post class defined above and include all CRUD operations. Repository. All right, let's see if that works. So here's an example of a Spring Data repository that extends JPA repository for the post class defined above and includes all CRUD operations. So public interface post repository extends JPA repository post and long. What I really like here is in this example, the post repository extends, the interface extends JPA repository and specifies the entity type is post and the type of its primary key, which is long. So it's explaining that code that it just wrote, which I really like. This internet interface provides a basic CRUD operation such as save, find all, find by ID, delete, etc., without requiring any additional implementation. Here's where it's wrong. The @repository annotation indicates that this is a repository component and makes it eligible for component scanning and auto wiring in the application context. So normally, if you create a class, this is true. You would need to, if you created your own repository, you would need to mark it with @repository. But because this is an interface, and Spring will take this interface and basically create an implementation of this at runtime, you don't need the @repository annotation. It will actually add it in, or the component in for you later on. So that's okay. Really close. Not a big deal. I like this. Let's go ahead and do this and head back to IntelliJ. So in here, I'm going to create a new, let's say new Java class. We're going to say this is called post repository. This is an interface, not that it matters. And I'm going to paste in my code here. And it looks like it got those imports correct. And I'm just going to do one more thing. I thought I was going to put this in a package called repository. That's okay, Dan. Let you slide this time. And there we go. So no need to implement any methods. That's true. I can take this out. And if we go ahead and click in this, we can see that JPA repository extends something called the list CRUD repository, which gives us some of those list methods. So if we want to say find all or find all by ID and get a list, we can. And then the type is post, and the ID type of post is a long. So it got that right. So we're doing good. Next is implement the REST API controllers using Spring MVC to handle the HTTP request and return responses. Let's see if we can just take this verbatim and paste this into ChatGPT. Ooh, so I like that it remembered that post entity. So it's going to base this controller off the post entity, which is exactly what we wanted. All right, looking good, looking good. So in this example, the post controller class is annotated with @REST controller. Great. That REST controller just says, hey, this is a controller that's going to accept requests and return responses. @request mapping is used to indicate that the REST API controller and to specify the base URL path for the API. Great. And I love that it did this. I've seen some examples where it kind of just put that on every single method, like /API/post, /API/post/ID. I like that it put it at the class level. This is a good convention to use. The post repository field is annotated with @AutoWire to inject an instance of the post repository interface. This is one way to do it. If you know me, you know this is not the way that I prefer to do it, or that Spring in general suggests that you can do dependency injection. We'll talk more about that in a second. The various HTTP methods, get, post, put, and delete, are handled using annotations such as get, post, put, delete. These are specialized versions of @request mapping, so I like that it's using that. The path variable and request body annotations are used to extract values from the URL and the request body, respectively. Great. So not only did they use those annotations here in a code, but it also walked through those. The methods perform the corresponding CRUD operations to the post entity using the post repository instance. I love it. I love what we got here. I'm going to go ahead and copy this. We're going to create a new controller called post controller. So let's head back over to IntelliJ. I'm going to create a new class. We're going to put this in a controller package this time. We're going to call this post controller. And here is our class. And let's see what we got here. So let's start talking through this code. We already kind of talked about this, so I'm going to leave this as is. The first thing is the post repository. So we need to get an instance of the post repository here in our post controller. How do we do it? We don't use @autowired here on the field. This is field level injection. This is not preferred. We want to use constructor level injection. The reason for this is, or constructor based injection. The reason for this is a whole bunch of things. One of which is testing. If we go to, like, say, mock out the repository in a test, this uses reflection. It gets a little messy. It's not a great way to do so. So what I want to do is I'm going to create this as a final, and then I'm going to go ahead and let IntelliJ help me out and says add a constructor parameter. And now this is implicitly basically saying @autowired. And because it's there's only a single constructor here, this is implicit. It's doing the auto wiring for us. But now we get an instance of our post repository through constructor injection. So this is a preferred method that I would take. Then we get a list of posts. We use our repository, find all. Great, I like it. We have a get mapping for an ID. This is using a dynamic ID. So we can say /API/post/1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So this is great. We're going to return, this actually returns a optional. So we're saying return that, or else throw a null. We can return null. The post mapping, create one. Again, we're expecting the post to come in through a request body. So go ahead and do that. We're using put mapping to update. This isn't the way I would do it. So I don't know why we're setting the ID here when we could have it come through on the request body. You may want to use that ID to just make sure that what ID is coming through is a valid one. So you could use the post repository to say, does it exist first? If it does, then go ahead and save it. But we'll leave it at that for now. And then delete by ID. That works as well. Awesome. So things are moving along. Let's go ahead and go back over to our README. Use the repository interface in the controllers to fetch or persist data to the database. So that's true. So I need a way to kind of test this out. I want to go ahead and insert at least one record. Then we can run the application and test the API using Postman. This is where it didn't exactly tell me what to do, but I'm going to see if ChatGPT can help us out. Let's say, write a command line runner bean that will insert a single post using the post repository. All right, here's an example of a command line runner bean that inserts a single post using the post repository. So this is using a component by itself. So that's one way that you could do it. So it's basically implementing that command line runner and then overriding run. It's creating a new post, setting a title, content, slug, using that post repository, saving it, and then printing that out. So cool. I like that it goes through and explains this as well. I'm going to copy this code and just show you an alternative, but you can go ahead and read through that. You can pause the video and read through this if you're interested. Okay, so I'm going to go over to my main application class. I'm going to create a bean, and we're going to create a command line runner. So that command line runner is a functional interface, which means that that is a perfect target for a Lambda. So we can just create a Lambda in here. Inside of that Lambda, or inside of this command line runner, we can get an instance of our post repository. Let's just call that repository. And then we can say post or repository.save that post, and then we can see if that was inserted. So we should have a toString here. So if everything we've done has been correct and we didn't miss anything, we should be able to run this and see this in the console. So let's go ahead and cross our fingers and go ahead and run our application. Wow, look at that. Well, on the first try, inserted a post, we have our post ID of 1. So again, we didn't set that ID. That's being generated by the database. So we have title, my first post. Here's our content, our slug, our date created, and our date updated. So cool. If we wanted to just change that to have that, let's just say post.set date created. So you can use a local date time.now. That would work. Let's go ahead and rerun that. And there we go. So cool. I think that is all we really need to do. We are able to run the application. Oh, we want to test this, right? So we inserted a record. We have one in the database. Let's test this out. Let's just test our controller to make sure that this is working. You can go through here and test all of these. I'm just going to test one. So again, we talked about using some type of tool called Postman or the command line. I'm going to use the HTTP client right here in IntelliJ. So you can come over here and say, generate this request in the HTTP client. So I'm going to have that here, and I'm going to say localhost 8080/API/posts. Give me all the posts in this application. And of course, there's only one, so it's going to just return that one as an array. And there's our post. So our, and actually, if we want to, let's just go ahead and test one other endpoint. Let's say that we wanted to say get/post/1, and let's just get that single post, and there it is. Awesome. I think that's it for today. I thought this was a really great exercise of talking about ChatGPT and where it can really be helpful. I thought we started out with a really good plan. We asked ChatGPT to give us a list of steps on how to create a REST API in Spring Boot, and it did that. I thought, it wasn't perfect, but as a set of steps to go ahead and do what we needed to do, I thought it was great. We went through and followed each of those steps. So now we can take each step and ask ChatGPT for more information. What I really love is the kind of context as you're asking questions. It remembers the things that we've been talking about. So when I said, create me a repository, I remember, oh, for the post thing we just created, I can do that. So I really enjoy that. Again, creating the three things that it does really well. One, give me a list of steps of how to do whatever we're trying to do today. Two, write me some specific code. We did that a couple times in here. Three, explain this kind of block of code. If you want to paste some of the code that was generated in here and have it, kind of tell you exactly what that code is, another great use case. So I'm a big fan of ChatGPT. It's not always going to be right, as we saw. It's not always the end-all, be-all. Do your research. Don't just take whatever it spits out, create an application, and put this into production. Probably not a great idea. But to help you be a more productive developer, check. And to help you learn new things, check. So I'm a really big fan of it. Another tool in my tool belt. I think it should be in your tool belt as well. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, hey, do me a favor. Those thumbs up are great. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel. And as always, happy coding, friends.